Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside to grab your mail, and finding a bright orange slip tucked right into your box. At first glance, you think it's junk, maybe a coupon or a flyer. But no, this was something much worse. It was a $500 fine from the HOA. And what was my crime? The color of my mailbox. That's right. According to the HOA's iron-fisted rules, my deep navy blue mailbox wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood. One mailbox color violation. And suddenly, I was out $500. Before we go any further into this nightmare-turned-legendary story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to HOA Secrets. This is the place where we expose the wildest, most unbelievable HOA dramas and Karen horror stories from across the country. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's about to unfold. Now, back to the madness. The HOA in my neighborhood wasn't just strict, it was suffocating. Everything had to fit their narrow, picture-perfect vision of suburbia. The grass could only be so long. The blinds in your windows had to be neutral colors. Even the type of flowers you planted in your front yard could be grounds for a written warning. But nothing, and I mean nothing, was as heavily policed as mailboxes. The board believed that mailboxes were the crown jewel of curb appeal. They had a whole booklet of approved colors and finishes, from bland beige to dull forest green. My navy blue mailbox wasn't on their sacred list. At first, I thought the fine was some kind of mistake. Surely no sane person could believe a slightly different shade of paint was worth $500. But when I called, the HOA president herself confirmed it with icy certainty. And if I didn't pay within 14 days, the fine would double. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about a mailbox. This was about power, about control, about Karen, the president of the HOA, reminding every homeowner that she was the queen of the neighborhood, and we were all her subjects. I could have rolled over, repainted the mailbox, and swallowed my pride. That's what they wanted. That's what most people did. But not me. Not this time. Because something in me snapped when I read that letter. If they wanted to play games over a mailbox, then fine. I'd play, but I wasn't just going to comply, was going to make a statement. The idea didn't come to me right away. For a few days, I just stewed in anger, staring at that stupid $500 notice on my fridge. Then one night, as I was flipping through channels, I landed on a documentary about medieval castles, stone walls, towering gates, and drawbridges designed to keep out invaders. Suddenly, it clicked. If Karen thought my little navy mailbox was such a threat to her perfect vision, then I'd give her a real problem. Not just a mailbox. A fortress. And so the plan was born. I would build a castle around my mailbox. Not a flimsy little structure either, but a full-blown miniature fortress in my front yard. Stone by stone, turret by turret. I would turn my violation into a monument. And I wouldn't just be fixing a problem, I'd be sending a message loud enough for the whole HOA to hear. You picked the wrong mailbox to mess with. Little did I know, this crazy idea would spark a war in my neighborhood. A war that would drag in city inspectors, news crews, and even lawyers. And it all started with a single $500 fine. The first step was research. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. I spent hours online, studying medieval architecture, watching videos of castle restorations, and even learning basic masonry techniques. I made sketches, drew up designs, and measured every inch of the space around my mailbox. This wasn't just about sticking rocks together. This was about creating something bold, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. When the first pile of stones arrived on a delivery truck, my neighbors gathered like moths to a flame. Whispers spread down the street. Some thought I was adding landscaping. Others guessed I was building a fancy planter. Nobody could have predicted what was really coming. By the end of the week, the base of the mailbox castle was taking shape. Thick stone walls rose from the ground, surrounding the post like a protective barrier. It already looked like something out of a storybook. Children riding their bikes would stop and stare. Passing cars slowed down to go, and I could feel Karen's eyes burning into me every time she drove by. The $500 fine had backfired. Instead of breaking me, it had lit a fire. And as the castle grew taller, so did the tension. I wasn't just building stone walls. I was building a battle line. And Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was about to launch her counterattack. They say a war doesn't begin with cannons, it begins with whispers. And in my neighborhood, the whispers started the second stone hit the ground in front of my house. My so-called mailbox project was no longer just mine. It had become the talk of every driveway, every sidewalk conversation, every neighborhood Facebook post. What I was building wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. And everyone knew Karen, the HOA president, was watching with fury. Before I dive deeper into how my mailbox fortress transformed the neighborhood into a battlefield, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to HOA Secrets. You won't want to miss the twists in this saga, cause trust me, the real chaos was just beginning. Back to the madness. At first the castle was just a novelty, a circle of stone around a mailbox, quirky, maybe even charming. Neighbors laughed as they passed, some cheering me on quietly, others shaking their heads, worried about what Karen might do next. But within days, as each new delivery of stone, wood, and mortar arrived, people realized this wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. This was real. The walls rose higher. Turrets began to take shape. I had studied enough medieval architecture to know how to make it look authentic, down to the crenellations along the top. By the end of the second week, my mailbox was no longer a humble post sticking out of the ground. It was the centerpiece of a fortress. It stood tall, proud, defiant, and every stone I laid was like a declaration of independence. Karen, of course, couldn't handle it. Her first move was subtle, an official violation letter. This time, not just for mailbox color, but for unauthorized structures. According to her, my castle violated the HOA landscaping and architectural guidelines. The fine, another $750, with a demand to remove the unapproved installation immediately. But here's the thing about me. Had anticipated this. I had studied the HOA bylaws line by line, looking for loopholes, and there it was. Buried deep in the legalese, a clause stating that decorative mailbox enclosures were allowed, provided they didn't obstruct sidewalks or roadways. Decorative. That one word was my shield. To me, this wasn't just a mailbox, it was a decorative enclosure, and no rule in the book could prove otherwise. I sent Karen a letter, back formal, polite, but dripping with defiance. I cited the bylaws, highlighted the clause, and closed with a single sentence: the mailbox castle stays. When she read it, I could almost hear her scream echoing across the cul-de-sac. But instead of backing down, Karen doubled down. Suddenly, the HOA board was holding emergency meetings. Neighbors whispered about petitions, legal threats, even the possibility of a lien on my property if I didn't comply. The board members who once shrugged at mailbox drama were now treating it like a full-blown crisis. And why? Because Karen saw my castle as more than a mailbox. She saw it as a direct challenge to her throne. And maybe she was right. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. My little act of rebellion was turning me into a neighborhood legend. People stopped by just to look at it. Kids posed for pictures. One neighbor even offered to bring beer and pizza while I worked. For the first time, the community wasn't rallying around Karen's strict rules. They were rallying around me. The castle had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up to the suffocating grip of the HOA. Of course, that only enraged Karen further. Within days, she escalated the fight. This time, she didn't just send me violation letters. She called the city. She tried to sic zoning inspectors on me. She claimed my mailbox castle was a safety hazard, an eyesore, even a threat to property values. And when that didn't stick, she threatened to take me to court. The stakes had officially gone beyond a mailbox. This was now a war of attrition, a battle of wills, and I was determined to win. But as I laid the final stones and stepped back to admire the completed fortress, a chill ran down my spine, because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to escalate, to drag the fight out until one of us broke. And she had just made her boldest move yet. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail, not from the HOA this time, but from a law firm. Karen had officially filed a lawsuit against me. This wasn't just fines and threats anymore. This was legal war. The castle was complete, and for a brief moment, I thought I had won. It stood proudly in my front yard, its stone walls catching the sunlight, its turrets defying the ordinary sameness of the neighborhood. But Karen was never one to accept defeat. Where others saw a mailbox with personality, she saw an insult carved in stone, a challenge to her rule. And Karen didn't take challenges lightly. The lawsuit arrived on a gray morning, its envelope heavier than paper had any right to be. Inside were pages upon pages of legal jargon, demanding the immediate removal of my so-called illegal structure. According to Karen's attorney, the mailbox castle was in violation of zoning codes, HOA covenants, and even community safety standards. If I didn't comply, the HOA threatened to pursue damages, legal fees, and the dreaded lien against my property. It was the nuclear option. For days, I felt the weight pressing down on me. Lawsuits on parking tickets. They're time-consuming, expensive, and designed to break you before you even set foot in a courtroom. That was Karen's real strategy, not to win, but to wear me down, to drown me in legal threats until I caved. But what she didn't count on was how far I was willing to go. I wasn't just building stone walls anymore. I was building resolve. I dove headfirst into research, combing through zoning ordinances, property rights cases, and court filings. The more I read, the more I realized how fragile Karen's case really was. My mailbox castle wasn't on city property, it was on mine. It didn't block sidewalks. It wasn't taller than the maximum height allowed for decorative structures. And most importantly, I had documented every step of the build, proving that it met the exact requirements outlined in the HOA's own covenants. But beyond the legal fight, something bigger was happening. The neighborhood itself was changing. People who had once lived in quiet fear of Karen's fines were starting to find their voices. A few even stopped by my yard to whisper encouragement. One neighbor confessed she'd been fined $200 for planting the wrong type of roses. Another admitted she'd paid $1,000 in fines over a garden shed Karen didn't like. Suddenly, my castle wasn't just a mailbox. It was a rallying point. Karen must have sensed it too, because her behavior grew more erratic. She stalked the edges of my yard with her phone out, snapping pictures, muttering about evidence. She cornered neighbors, warning them that siding with me would tank their property values. She even called the police one evening, claiming the castle was blocking emergency access. The officers took one look, shook their heads, and left. Each failed attempt only deepened her obsession. And then came the night that changed everything. I was sitting on my porch, admiring the silhouette of my fortress in the moonlight, when I noticed movement at the edge of the yard. At first, I thought it was an animal. But then I saw the flashlight beam flicker across the stones, followed by the unmistakable outline of Karen herself. She was trespassing, creeping through my property, phone in hand, recording every angle of the mailbox. She muttered under her breath, furious, frantic, like someone trying to capture proof of a crime that didn't exist. I didn't confront her that night. I just watched, because in that moment, I realized something critical. Karen wasn't fighting for the community. She wasn't fighting for rules or values or aesthetics. She was fighting for control. And worse, she was losing it. Her obsession with my mailbox had consumed her, and the deeper she spiraled, the stronger my position became. Neighbors started pulling away from her. The whispers turned into conversations. The conversations turned into quiet defiance. The HOA's once unshakable grip was starting to crack. But Karen wasn't finished. If anything, she was about to become more dangerous than ever. Because when the court date finally arrived, Karen came prepared, not just with her lawyer, but with a folder so thick it looked like a novel. She was ready to drag me through the mud, to paint me as a reckless neighbor bent on destroying the harmony of the community. What she didn't know was that I'd come prepared to dot, and when the truth came out in that courtroom, it would shake the foundation of the HOA itself. The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. For weeks, Karen had paraded around the neighborhood, boasting that she would crush me in court, that my so-called mailbox monstrosity would be torn down, and that justice would be served in the name of community values. But what she failed to see was that her obsession had blinded her to the cracks in her own case. The courthouse was a world away from suburban streets. No clipped lawns, no pastel siding, no carefully arranged flower beds, just cold walls, polished floors, and the echo of shoes against tile. Karen sat near the front with her attorney, clutching a stack of papers so thick, it looked like she had compiled an encyclopedia of my sins. Her eyes darted to me, sharp and burning, as though sheer hatred could intimidate me into folding. The judge entered, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any HOA fine ever could. This was no longer Karen's playground. This was neutral ground, where evidence, not intimidation, would decide the outcome. Karen's lawyer struck first. He launched into a polished speech about a resident who defied community standards and a structure that threatened property values and neighborhood harmony. He waved pictures of my castle like smoking guns, arguing that it was an eyesore, a safety hazard, and a direct violation of the HOA covenant. Each point was delivered with theatrical flourish, as though he believed the sheer drama of his words could mask their fragility. Karen nodded vigorously through it all, her smug smile flashing every time the lawyer said violation. To her, this was already over. But then my turn came. I stood with a calm I didn't entirely feel, holding a slim folder, nothing compared to Karen's mountain of accusations. Yet inside it were the keys to unraveling her entire case. I presented photographs, permits, and HOA bylaws highlighted line by line. I showed how the structure was well within the allowed height for decorative landscaping. I pointed out that the covenant didn't prohibit stonework, turrets, or flags. Most importantly, I proved that the mailbox itself, the functional part, met every single postal regulation. Karen's lawyer interrupted, objected, tried to twist words into shapes they were never meant to hold. But each time, the judge cut through the noise, asking for clarity. And clarity was on my side. Then I revealed the final piece. A record of Karen's history of complaints and fines against multiple neighbors. All for petty reasons: the roses, the trash cans, the sheds. One by one, I laid out how her enforcement wasn't about fairness, but about personal control. The courtroom shifted. The narrative wasn't a man defying the HOA. It was an HOA president, weaponizing her power. By the time I finished, Karen's confidence had evaporated. She sat rigid, her fingers digging into the folder, lips tight as the judge scribbled notes. The decision didn't come that day, but the air had changed. Everyone could feel it. The weight of her authority was crumbling under the spotlight of truth. When we walked out of that courtroom, Karen tried to glare at me, but there was no victory in her eyes. For the first time, she looked unsure, as though the castle she thought she had built out of rules and fines was nothing but sand. But the fight wasn't over. The HOA still had money, influence, and fear on its side. Karen wasn't going to stop just because she'd been embarrassed in court. No, this loss would only push her further, make her more reckless. And while I had won the battle of the courtroom, the war for the neighborhood was about to enter its most dangerous stage. Yet, because Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, she was the type to double down. Court had rattled Karen, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it seemed to ignite a new fury inside her, one that made the entire neighborhood uneasy. For years, she had ruled with clipped notes and fines tucked in mailboxes. Now, stripped of her courtroom invincibility, she turned to something far uglier: intimidation. It began subtly. My trash bins were mysteriously knocked over the night before collection. Tire tracks appeared across my lawn, deep ruts carved into the grass. Anonymous complaints poured into the HOA office, all citing fabricated violations tied conveniently to my property noise complaints on nights I wasn't home. Allegations of unkempt landscaping when my yard was pristine. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but the pattern grew too sharp, too deliberate. And every arrow pointed back to the same source: Karen. The neighborhood began to fracture. Some residents quietly applauded my defiance, slipping me supportive notes or offering to testify if the fight dragged on. But others, terrified of becoming Karen's next target, distanced themselves. The air on our once pleasant street turned heavy, charged with suspicion. Every nod from a neighbor carried an unspoken question: whose side are you on? Karen doubled down at HOA meetings, rallying the board with fiery speeches about community, integrity, and the danger of one man undermining the rules. Her allies echoed her outrage, but their words rang hollow against the silence of those who had grown weary of her reign. Then came the stunt that pushed everything over the edge. One morning, I woke to find a massive banner draped across the entrance of the neighborhood. In bold red letters, it declared, "Castleman is destroying property values." The message was signed, quite proudly, by the HOA board. It was public shaming at its most desperate, a declaration of war not just on me, but on anyone who dared stand in the way of Karen's authority. But what Karen didn't anticipate was the ripple effect. Instead of isolating me, the banner galvanized the community. Neighbors began whispering not just about her pettiness, but about her abuse of power. People who had once kept their heads down started remembering their own grievances, fines, threats, and arbitrary rules that had chipped away at their peace of mind for years. My mailbox had become more than a rebellion. It was a symbol of resistance. Karen must have sensed the tide turning, because her tactics grew more frantic. Late at night, I'd catch glimpses of her circling the castle, camera in hand, as though if she took enough photos, she might find the smoking gun she so desperately needed. On more than one occasion, I spotted her scribbling in a notebook, muttering to herself as though preparing for battle. But in her obsession, she made a fatal miscalculation. She forgot that the more she attacked, the more attention she drew to her own behavior. And attention was the last thing she could afford. Because while she was busy plotting against me, others in the neighborhood had begun organizing quietly, carefully, and with one goal in mind: to take back control of the HOA itself. Karen had built her empire on fear, but fear was losing its grip, and when it finally snapped, the fall would be spectacular. The only question was how much damage she'd cause before it all came crashing down. The banner was the beginning of the end. What Karen thought would shame me instead exposed her obsession. The neighborhood, tired of living under constant surveillance and fines, finally woke up. Quiet whispers turned into conversations on driveways, backyards, and late-night texts. For the first time in years, people weren't just complaining about Karen. They were planning to act. The rebellion wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One by one, homeowners began digging through old notices, fines, and letters. They realized just how much money had been squeezed from them under flimsy pretenses. Stories surfaced of Karen finding families for kids' toys left outside for a single afternoon, or threatening retirees over garden gnomes. She hadn't been protecting the neighborhood. She had been controlling it. When the next HOA election rolled around, the turnout was historic. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, eyes sharp, papers in hand. Karen stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence. But there was something different in the room: a collective resolve. The vote wasn't close. One by one, ballots were cast, not for Karen, not for her allies, but for new faces, fresh voices, who promised transparency and fairness. When the final tally was read, Karen was out. Stripped of her title, her influence evaporated overnight. The castle mailbox still stood tall, not just as a defiant monument, but as a reminder. Unchecked power crumbles when people unite. Karen disappeared from the spotlight soon after, retreating into the very shadows she once used to intimidate others. But her legacy wasn't fear anymore. It was the cautionary tale of how far someone can fall when pride and control replace community and respect. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The trash stayed upright, the lawn grew green again, and neighbors waved without the tension of hidden agendas. My mailbox fortress became a neighborhood landmark, not a battleground. Parents would walk their kids past it, pointing and laughing at the story of the mailbox castle that toppled a queen. And that's the moral. Sometimes the fight isn't really about a mailbox. It's about standing up to unfairness, no matter how small it starts, because small injustices, left unchecked, grow into empires of control. But when people unite, even the most ridiculous battles, like the color of a mailbox can, spark change. So, if you enjoyed this saga of Karen, the HOA board, and the legendary castle mailbox, hit that like button and subscribe to HOA Secrets. Let's keep sharing these wild stories together, because you never know whose castle might be next.